All right, welcome back, everybody in MEA 100. Hope life is treating you well, and we're getting near the end of the semester here, so I'm sure you're probably excited about that. Hopefully, you've already clicked on my earlier YouTube lecture on the first part of books, part one. That obviously dealt primarily with kind of the reasons that we have books. We talked about the impact of books from a standpoint of how impressionable they are. We also got into a conversation about censorship that I'm sure probably stirred some emotion in you, which is exactly what I wanted it to, and I hope that you've spent some time sort of examining that out there in Google land, if you will. So, but we're gonna turn away from that now and get into part two and focus more on the history of books today, as well as talking about book publishing, and then probably land the plane when we talk a little bit about ebooks. So let's go ahead and talk about history now. Books are clearly the oldest and most enduring of the mass media. So we've talked about a lot of different forms of mass communication this semester, everything from television to internet to film, radio, etc. All those things have a lasting history, but certainly books, almost goes way back to the beginning of time, right? Gutenberg, I should say, first of all, Gutenberg printed his first book in the 15th century, right? The Bible. That was obviously a seminal moment. Public libraries have been around for hundreds of years, and many, of course, including maybe someone in your family, have extensive collections of books in their homes. I certainly know that my parents, particularly my stepfather, who I mentioned in part one, was an avid reader. And one of the things that I distinctly remember after he passed away back in 2009, and my mom passed away in 2015, we had to sell their house down in the San Fernando Valley, and they, the amount of books, photographs too, by the way, the amount of books that we pulled out of that house and later gave to libraries or Goodwill or whatever was remarkable. I had no idea, as I knew we had a lot of books, but I didn't know how many until we started, basically packing them up. So anyway, here's to you, Ken. All right, let's talk about the history of books though. So early books were inscribed by hand and decorated. So they weren't always what you remember them now, which is obviously off a printing press. They were works of art. In fact, most early books were put together in monasteries by monks. Basically, that changed when, and so obviously, with the basics of supply and demand, that the less that you have, the more the price goes up, right? And that, of course, changed when Johann Gutenberg's printing press was invented. That was an actual game changer. In fact, when he printed his first book, which was the Bible, no, he was not the author of the Bible, he just printed the Bible. It cost the equivalent of 3 years of wages for the typical laborer of the time. 3 years of wages. So books, though, at that point spread across Europe. They showed up in England in 1476. Henry VIII recognized its potential as a political force, required all printers to obtain government approval prior to printing. And of course, we know that one of the aspects of Gutenberg's invention was, of course, the Protestant Reformation, right? Words on a page, absolutely influential. And certainly he had a big part in not just, essentially fanning the flames of a new religion, but so much else. So, but really what I want to focus on, because there's so much that you could talk about with book history, I really want to focus on North America. I'm going to be a little, like isolated here, right? But that's okay. So in any event, the earliest colonists came to the United States for two reasons, or came to the colonies at that point, because it wasn't the United States. And again, this was late 17th century, early 18th century. They were trying to find economic opportunities not available in Europe. Many of them, obviously, you've studied the Puritans, right? Were escaping religious prosecution or persecution. And so it's not surprising then that most books that were brought to the quote unquote new world were religious in nature, because the folks who were coming over here were highly religious themselves. But those who made the journey tended to be poor, uneducated, largely illiterate. So you had a majority of the public coming over that didn't know how to read, nor did they have the financial means to buy books at that point. It wasn't part of their priority. That's not to say there wasn't some elite that were here, and generally the elite folks were the ones that were doing the reading and purchasing. We talked about that when we discussed newspapers, that the newspapers, at least initially, were really geared, and publishing in general was really geared toward people that read and sort of the upper class. But and that makes sense, right? Settlers here didn't find books a central focus, right? It was a simple fight for survival, right? They were trying to just survive. People worked from sunrise to sunset. There was no electricity, there was no power, no light. If there was light, it was by candlelight. And just basically, they were just trying to get from one day to the next. And so there was no real need to read at night, nor motivation for that matter, because they were just, literally exhausted from trying to survive during the day, and books just weren't a priority, right? At that point, books symbolized wealth and status, something early settlers didn't identify with. And honestly, although we said that there were some books that did make a voyage, religious in nature in general, a lot of books didn't make it because, people would not be carrying a lot of stuff with them on their voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. And if they were carrying stuff, it was not books. So anyway, that was the early part of our, founding here as a country. But we do see, as we get, we start to establish our presence here in the, in the colonies on the East Coast. 90,000 titles were published across the colonies. Early publishers were also printers and even authors. So we talked about, obviously, Ben Franklin being a newspaper publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, if you remember. Well, he was also publishing a book called Poor Richard's Almanac in 1732. It sold 10,000 copies a year. It contained the calendar, weather, poems, astronomical and astrological information that a typical almanac of the period would contain. He also included the occasional mathematical exercise, and the almanac from 1750 features an early example of demographics. He's chiefly remembered as Ben for being a repository of aphorisms, and proverbs, many of which live on in the American English. Anyway, so sold 10,000 copies a year. But as you can see, as we get closer to the Revolutionary War, which obviously, was 1776, most book content was religious, and then later, of course, became political, which very much reflected the times, because we were in the middle of separating from England. And so it very much dominated our culture and our talk. And, you can see some of the full circle stuff here in, 2022 with what we're fixated on, right? A lot of it's race and gender, and certainly it'll be interesting to see as the economic squeeze continues here, whether those two will stay consistently on our front plate, or we'll start seeing more books about economics and et cetera. So I don't know, I'm not an expert in that. All right, as we get to the 19th century, though, the 1800s, okay, remember when we were talking about newspapers, we were talking about the penny press, right? And we talked about the fact that you had another like a more technologically faster printing press invented in the 1830s that printed, several thousand copies an hour. And of course, we talked about the fact that so we had a greater supply, we had, faster way of making copies. We had 19th century, you start to see, along with newspapers becoming popular, the fact that we have an education system, a public education system starting to be established in the 1830s and beyond. And that all benefited the newspaper industry, also benefited the publishing industry, right? Books become more specialized, just like the newspapers were becoming more specialized. And of course, they were cheaper because of that penny press. Book prices declined. So now, instead of just elite people being able to afford a book, you could actually have normal, like everyday people afford books. Authors during this time included James Fenimore Cooper, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Better public education system and the penny press created demand for further reading materials. Textbooks actually, believe it or not, become popular in the 1840s. That's like 180 years ago. Probably didn't know that, I bet. All right. We talked about at the very beginning of part one about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was published in 1852 and sold 300,000 copies. It was anti-slavery, which very much, I think, psychologically laid the foundation for essentially folks in the northern part of the country looking at how the South was doing business and wanting to obviously change that. And so it wasn't very long after that the Civil War happened, in 1860, that essentially led to slavery being eliminated, right? And speaking of the Civil War, lots of idle time that was spent reading between, armies from the North, armies from the South. And so they were actually reading paperbacks. That's when you see paperbacks first appear during the 1860s. Now, what's interesting is a lot of these paperbacks were just, reprints of just books from Europe and other places, and they were blatant copies. Copyright laws became a problem. And so you see some copyright infringement happened in the latter part of the 19th century, and that essentially, or at least for a time, choked off what's called the paperback industry. Although it does make a comeback. As we get into the 20th century, publishing becomes more commercialized. You actually see the appearance of literary agents, right? Pushing for better deals for authors, which drove the price of publishing a book up more and made it more of a business, right? So the fact is that you had people advocating, if you were someone that was a creative writer at the time or wanted to publish a book, you would go through a literary agent to get yourself published. Publishers turned to fiction to attract more readers. So as we get into World War I, essentially, you start to see this real and I'll tell you, this is why. If you think about it, what also was happening, at the very beginning of the 20th century that was making the narrative so exciting? Film was making narrative great. And so not only were you having narrative on screen, but you were also having fictional narrative on page, right? And so books kind of, I think, mirrored what was happening in the cinema universe at this point. And so people were far more interested, at least at that point, into fiction, which attracted more readers. You have Margaret Mitchell's Call of the Wild. Sorry, my bad. Jack London's Call of the Wild. Margaret Mitchell was Gone with the Wind. Two very classic novels, and sold lots of copies, of course. Paperbacks reemerge after World War II. Right. So we obviously, got through 2 world wars in the span of like 25 or 30 years, more leisure time following World War II, this ability for people to go, we're exhaling as it's been. We've just survived World War I. We just went through the Great Depression. We just went through World War II. If we were talking magazines this semester, a lot of magazine publishers, some of the more famous magazine titles kind of popped up during this time. So not only the book and publishing industry was absolutely booming after World War II, but so too was the magazine industry. And of course, something that was very typical and still is today, quite honestly, in the 21st century, is this idea of consolidation and acquisition, that you were seeing it start to appear at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, where it was happening in the newspaper industry, it was happening in private, commercial, where you would have, bigger companies kind of swallowing smaller companies, or companies that were forming, big companies that were forming partnerships, to kind of cut down on costs. So, and that, of course, is something that, obviously still is prevalent today. All right. In fact, I have a number here. Large corporations began acquiring book companies between 1958 and 1970. There were 307 mergers or acquisitions of publishing companies. These mergers brought new financial and management resources to the book industry, but ultimately profitability sagged in the 1970s. All right, how about some modern day authors, right? You can't talk books without talking about some familiar names, right? I think, it's interesting to see if the further we get away from the series, the television series, if he remains as popular. But George R.R. Martin, of Game of Thrones fame, obviously wrote a series of books. And of course, he's always been hinting that he would somehow write his own ending to the series, different from how HBO went. But in any event, obviously the Game of Thrones, which was a very popular show on HBO and still, people watch, that was actually a series of books first by George R.R. Martin. James Patterson, another popular author these days. He has at least 42 books, maybe more now. Stephen King, honestly, I asked you guys who, your three favorite books are, or authors, or whatever it was on your discussion topic. I put Stephen King right at the very top of my list. I still, to this day, remember the first book that I read. It was, well, actually, I think Tommyknockers was the first book, but the first book that really kind of impacted me was the book It, Pennywise, the clown. So if you don't know your Stephen King, knowledge, you probably have seen the movie It or heard of it. Well, the book's just as frightening, if not more. So in any event, I love Stephen King. But what's interesting about Stephen King is that he was somebody that wrote so much that he actually wanted to see if he wrote as somebody else, if he would be as popular. Just because, the minute you become like this big name in the publishing industry, or even think about it from a film industry, if you're a big name celebrity, people just automatically want to flock to see whatever your latest film is. Well, in his case, he actually wrote as Richard Bachman. That was there was a time in the 80s where he published a few books under the pseudonym Richard Bachman. And it was basically his way of trying to see if Richard Bachman could be as popular as Stephen King. Now, ultimately, folks found out that Stephen King was writing as Richard Bachman, so it kind of stained the experiment, if you would. But anyway, some little known trivia about Stephen King. One other thing you should know about him, by the way, is because I went to school in Colorado. He actually got his start as a writer for the local paper in Boulder, Colorado. And so, if you've ever seen The Shining, that's the one with Jack Nicholson, classic film. That whole movie, that whole storyline was inspired by a hotel that was just north of Boulder in Estes Park. I actually think they shot it in Portland, but or in Oregon somewhere. But the actual idea for it came from him living in Boulder, Colorado. So kind of cool. Most of his books wind up doing something in Maine, but in this case, it was definitely a Colorado-based book. All right. Anyway, you guys know J.K. Rowling. I'm sure that you, at some point, as you've grown up, have read her Harry Potter books. 500 million copies worldwide in 80 languages. I've got a really cool story about her, by the way. Here's some little facts about J.K. Rowling. Now, I know she's been in the news from other stuff, but this is all positive. So, publisher initially worried that being a female, that she wouldn't be attractive to young males, so to buy the book, so they had her go as J.K. instead of Joanne. That's her actual given name. She thought of Harry Potter she thought of Harry Potter while stuck on a train for 4 hours. Eventually finished her first manuscript in 1995. She took it to 12 publishing houses. They all rejected it. Eventually, one publisher gave her a $3,000 advance, and it was because the 8-year-old daughter of that publisher had read the first chapter and demanded more. That's a true story. That's actually how it started. That publisher initially only printed 1,000 copies, half of which went to libraries. And of course, now the Harry Potter brand is worth north of $15 billion. We've got theme parks, we've got books, we've got movies. And it's just, it's quite amazing. And I know she's obviously been in the news for, her thoughts on gender. I'm not going to get into it, but when you might have heard J.K. Rowling more in the last year or two about that than her books, but still an impressive author and impressive storyteller. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about ebooks. That's kind of like the most modern aspect of, I think, book publishing at this point. Very popular, but not a new concept, believe it or not. In the first ebook, by the way, for your trivia's sake, is the Declaration of Independence, not the one that was written in 1776, but when it was digitized in 1971, it became officially the first ebook, Declaration of Independence. E-readers in 1998 made their debut. Basically, that essentially led to Amazon launching Kindle in 2007. Amazon at one point, believe it or not, was a website devoted to buying books. Of course, now it's everything, but it actually centered on books when it first started. Jeff Bezos did. In 2021, so last year, ebook revenue in the United States declined 4.7%, generated $1.1 billion in sales. Digital audiobooks continue to grow with a 13.4%, I don't know what I wrote there. Digital audiobooks continue to grow 13.4% in revenue, or actually it's up 13.4%. That's what I was trying to write there, reaching $766.2 billion in revenue. An easier way to look at this is check out ebook sales in the United States from 2017 to 2021, according to Statista. It's been pretty, I think it's kind of leveled out. I would love, here's another comment you can make at the bottom of this YouTube link if you want. Tell me what you prefer. Do you like being able to read an ebook? Do you like a Kindle, for example, or do you like actually being able to physically hold the book in your hand and kind of read it old school? I will be honest with you. I'm an old school guy. I like, not that I obviously use the internet like crazy, but when it comes to books, I like to just basically read them. So one of my favorite things to do is on vacation or on a plane, by the way. All right. Anyway, you can look at that number there. So any of you out there want to be an author? All right. Maybe you took this course because you're a creative writer. Maybe you are a creative writer and thought about writing a story at some point or a book. Well, it's not. If we had this conversation 20 or 25 years ago, we'd have a different, I'd have a little bit different message. I would say, man, you have an uphill mountain to really kind of scale. But I think it's, certainly I think modern technology has made it easier. But let's just say you want to deal with a publishing house, right? Well, you could just send what's called a manuscript to a publishing house. That would be a manuscript to an editor, hoping someone will see it, magically speaking, if you will, and give you a deal. The problem is it's going to mostly end up in a pile of slush. And for my screenplay writers, by the way, this is also true. I could also say the same thing about my industry, broadcast journalism. But the bottom line is that it's a very much who you know kind of industry, as in any industry, any creative industry is. And so mostly, publishing houses are generally taking already well-established writers and actually then approaching them and saying, okay, here's our idea. Can you write, can you put together a manuscript? Can you put together essentially a book on this? And that's what happens. And the same thing is happening with screenplay writing. It happens in the publishing industry. But if you are trying to get in the front door as a quote into a publishing house, you're going to have to include that cover letter and description of your book. You need to list reasons why the book should be published, right? Who's going to read it? It's called analysis of readership. Who's going to read it? What's your age group, demographic, et cetera? Because obviously that publisher wants to make money, right? And in all honesty, you're probably not going to have success. You might, and if you do, awesome. Okay. But there's another way to do it now because of the internet, because again, when you get to filmmaking, people can do this obviously with YouTube and Vimeo and all these other, these third-party, platforms. The same thing can be done with the book industry. publishing on demand, which is to say that you can actually go through a service on the internet where you publish your own book, and you can share that out there, and use social media to to promote it. Maybe Amazon will actually pick up your thing, pick up your idea. There's a ways to skirt around the old school way. In fact, I have a very good friend who was somebody that escaped Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution, and about 5, 6, 7 years ago now, she decided to write a sort of a life story on her, not only her escaping communism, but coming here and establishing a family, and cool book. Not written in a traditional sense, in the sense that she had a good friend help her edit it, but I mean I wouldn't say it was a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, but it certainly was good enough that she was able, there were colleges that picked up on it and other universities and schools. And so she wound up, going to several of these schools and talking about her experiences, and, it was really cool. So, there's a need for publishing on demand that you can take advantage of. All right, last but not least, let's talk a little bit about the business, which is your top publishers. I will provide a link for you. In fact, I will just provide this link in the module, along with all the other links that on one page for you. But basically, the U.S. book publishing industry generated by the way, generated an estimated $26.23 billion in net revenue. This is 2021. 675 million print books were sold last year in the U.S. alone. Relatively new book formats such as ebooks and audiobooks are already bringing in billions of US dollars in revenue each year. 2 million books are published each year. 55% of all trade books purchased in the US were Amazon sales. USA accounts for 29% of all global book sales by revenue. And the biggest big five publishers are Penguin Random House, Hachette Livre, HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster, and Macmillan Publishers. And then this link also takes you to the top 10 publishing companies in the world, which list is a little bit different, but basically it's based on factors including popularity, revenue, and influence. So take a look at that. You might see a question or two on obviously a future test on something from this material. So anyway. You have 4 major departments in a book publishing house. You have the editorial side, which obviously is the side that puts together the book, not the actual physical part of putting the book, but certainly creating it, right? So they they choose which book to publish. Essentially, that's also the obligation of the editorial side. The production side oversees the physical design of a book. The type style, the composition, the paper, the printing, the binding, and one of the cool things about, obviously, I think about books is especially the not the ebooks, but it's just how they design a book, right? Like this one here, kind of cool. Sort of reminds me of a playing card in a way because it's about poker, right? Then you have marketing and advertising, supervises sales, promotions, and publicity. Advertises in trade magazines. We talked about how marketing, is such a big deal when it comes to, the cost of a book. That's in that department, obviously. And then, of course, you have the business department, which is accounting and budgeting. And so that wraps up, kind of our, our 2-part lecture on books. I want to remind you that you have a discussion topic based on this chapter. And which kind of leaves us, I think, one final major component, which will be, we'll talk about advertising, but hopefully you've enjoyed this conversation about books, both in part 1 and part 2. And that is all. So you have an outstanding day.